All right, ladies and gentlemen, now we're going to talk about the causes or some of the causes to why the Syrian Arab Republic collapsed. And I will start with the neoliberal policies that were fueled under the regime of Bashar al-Assad. It started in the late 2000s, I believe, or early 2000s, somewhere there. A lot of people, a lot of analysts describe the war as like a war between democracy and authoritarianism or something like that, without taking in the materialistic dialectical issues that led up to the protests and so forth, because the initial protests were actually legitimate. Uh, there was growing class differences or class divides in Syria. There was poverty coming up in Syria. The welfare system started to, I'm not saying collapsing, but it was being privatized and sent to being sourced out to NGOs instead of being handled by the state. State industries were getting slowly but surely outmaneuvered or outcompeted by foreign companies because of the IMF privatization programs that Bashar al-Assad was implementing. And yes, it is true that during this time, I believe it's like 2007 or 9 and 10, during this era, the annual growth for Syria was like 4.3% GDP, but it was only for a subset of the Syrian society. So the wealthy, basically. And I would argue, and the analysts as well that are here argue that this is a huge contributing factor to why people in Syria started to rise up. And to be frank with you, I think that can be a factor in Iran as well, because Iran has also gone through this route to a large extent with privatizations since the 1990s. And this creates poverty, it creates class divide, a larger class divide, and that will be a huge source of unrest in a country. My issue with some of these axis of resistance, anti-imperialist countries, be it Venezuela, be it Iran, be it Syria, is that they talk a lot about anti-imperialism. They talk a lot of, and they do anti-imperialist things. They do support the Palestinian resistance. They do. I'm not denying that. But at the same time, you have a subset of people in these countries that have a pretty, they have a lot of power, actually. In the Iranian case, it would be the reformists. And these guys have been pushing for better relations with the West. They want to privatize even more. I would describe them almost as a fifth column, and a lot of people probably would disagree with me on that, but I believe that they are. And to me, it's like you can't have this sort of image of democracy when you're in a state of war. Because make no mistake, Iran, Syria, these countries, even if for a long time they weren't perhaps confronting Western powers and Israel militarily directly, they were at war. I'm not just talking militarily, I'm talking economically, culturally, and so forth. And you can't confront this enemy with a fake notion of liberalism or neoliberalism or fake democracy, okay? It just doesn't work. You have to go the North Korean style. That's the only way. That's how I see it, And to be frankly honest with you, and this can sound counterintuitive, but when it comes to the axis of resistance, I feel like they didn't go in wholeheartedly when it came to the war with Israel. Israel did have a lot of strategic hits that hurt the axis of resistance, the killing of Nasrallah and a large portion of the top leadership in Hezbollah. They still believe in this weird, notion that you can negotiate with your enemy. Sometimes you can. I'm not saying that, but The problem is the Israelis and to a large extent the Europeans and Americans, they don't stand by their contracts. The only language these people understand is violence. And if you're not all wars, I hate to say it, but they're not necessarily bad in that sense because some wars are necessary. They are bad, but they're necessary. Let's just say it like that. If you want to get rid of this cancerous tumor, which is this colonial entity that the West set up in this part of the world to use almost as a mercenary force to, along with their jihadist proxies, obviously, to subdue and conquer and divide the region, you must use extremes amount of force with them, okay? I personally, in certain elements of Iranian society, felt that, you know what, hypersonic missiles have to reign over Tel Aviv. There's just no other way. You have to answer with as much force as you can. Well, the Israelis are going to retaliate and start. Yes, they are going to retaliate. It's the name of the effing game, my man. Okay? You have to have a greater war to get rid of this tumor. That's the way it is. I'm not saying all Jewish people should be kicked out. I'm not saying that at all. But people who are followers of this Zionist, right-wing, fascistic ideology, yes, they should be kicked out. Are there Jewish people in Israel, specifically, I think it's Hasidic Jews, that or certain, in this case, very few left-wing secular ones that want to live in peace with Palestinians? Yes, I think those people, should stay. But at the end of the day, it's a thing that these two people have to solve. But if you ask me personally, yes, they can. But people who are settlers, they come from Brooklyn, Eastern Europe, Miami, New York, LA, and Jews from Britain, whatever, who come there and just steal land from Arabs in the West Bank, that's crazy to me. Like, these people shouldn't even be there. So, but anyway, let's proceed. I went on a rant there. This is from Tehran Times. It's written by Sayed Yasser Jebrali, and how neoliberal policies fuel the fall of Assad. So, while some attribute turmoil to external pressures such as Western sanctions and authoritarian governance, one critical factor remains underappreciated: the neoliberal policies implemented during Bashar al-Assad's presidency. Yes, Western sanctions. This is a good one. If you're gonna, this is basically economic warfare, right? If you're gonna withstand Western sanctions, you have to have a strong state control over large portions of your economy. I'm not saying necessarily all of it, but many sectors of it. That includes banking, that includes schools, that's education, healthcare, and infrastructure, and the military, obviously, right? And so forth. You cannot have this neoliberal shit show that we see in many of these countries. Anyway, these market-focused reforms, heralded as harbingers of growth and modernization, instead bred widespread discontent among Syrians, weakening societal structures and paving the way for extremist groups to emerge. To understand the impact of these policies, it's essential to examine the context in which neoliberal policies were introduced. During Hafez al-Assad's presidency, in the beginning in 1971, the Ba'ath Party built a comprehensive welfare state focusing on national production and public services. So Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, had a more state-run economy. Keep that in mind. Despite the authoritarian nature of the government, this approach yielded tangible benefits such as free healthcare and education through university levels. The emphasis on agricultural production fostered self-sufficiency and strategic crops. Sounds great to me for a country that's, under such heavy pressure, right? Leading to lower prices for essential goods. This stability supported social cohesion by guaranteeing millions of Syrians a baseline standard of living. Though limited in some respects, the welfare state offered a sense of security and underpinning a relatively cohesive society. And he's absolutely correct about that. If you get the economy somewhat stable and have, some form of fair resource distribution, your society will become more stable despite being under economic sanctions. So, but there are elites in these countries that are extremely greedy. I call them fifth columnists. It's usually the bourgeoisie in these countries a lot of times, and they just want more and more, and eventually this greed, this capitalistic greed, collapses the society. And we see this in Syria. Uh, Anyway, however, when Bashar al-Assad took power in the 2000s, in 2000, Syria shifted from a state-led welfare model to neoliberal economic reforms aimed at integrating the country into the into the global economy. These reform strategies included opening markets to foreign trade, dramatically reducing import restrictions, and privatizing state-owned enterprises. Between 2000 and 2007, the number of goods restricted from importation dropped from 3,000 to just 100, exemplifying Syria's new market-oriented stance designed to attract foreign investors. However, this also exposed domestic industries to international competition, revealing long-standing inefficiencies. Let's see here. The reform of the banking sector further accelerated this transition. In 2001, the introduction of the private banks law facilitated the emergence of new private banks with foreign investors, fundamentally altering Syria's financial landscape. By 2018, Syria hosted 14 private banks, significantly foreign-owned. This shift, meant to invigorate the economy, largely failed to deliver on promised growth. The liberalization of the agricultural sector was another contentious initiative. State farms, which had been collectively owned since Hafez's era, were privatized, resulting in a sharp concentration of land ownership. By 2008, a mere 28% of farmers controlled 75% of irrigated land, while nearly half of the farmers held a scant 10%. This privatization decimated the agricultural workforce, which fell by 40% between 2002 and 2008. Employment in agriculture dropped from 32.9% in 2000 to a mere 14% by 2011, undermining rural economies and displacing countless workers. The health sector also succumbed to neoliberal reform under Bashar al-Assad, marked by a shift toward commercialization driven by EU-endorsed health sector modernization program ratified in 2003. Public health service quality and availability declined, pushing many Syrians toward privatized healthcare options. Because when you privatize the healthcare system or the housing system, it's no longer for the needs of the people. It is for owners of these capitalists to make more profits. That's it. Which will, in many cases, make the quality worse, right? From an international standpoint, Syrian healthcare spending plummeted to dismal 0.4% of GDP before 2010, contrasting sharply with the global norm of 5 to 12.5%. These included drastic subsidy. Oh dear. Damn. I don't know what happened. Hold on a second. Just a second. 12.5%. A second wave of neoliberal reforms. Okay. All right. Sorry. I don't know why the page jumped like that. A second wave of neoliberal reforms commenced in 2005, following extensive consultations with the IMF and the World Bank. These included drastic subsidy cuts, which in 2008 led to diesel price skyrocketing by 257%. Resulting production cost hikes forced many farmers to migrate to urban areas, in search of employment, while industrial sectors were similarly crippled by increased expenses. Consequently, essential goods became unaffordable for many, contributing to inflation and exasperating widespread financial strain. The neoliberal agenda yielded uneven rewards, benefiting the elite and foreign investors, particularly from Persian Gulf monarchies. And with this money from the Persian Gulf, obviously came Wahhabi indoctrination, because these charities from Saudi Arabia were usually preaching in the countryside and radicalized people. But anyway, while burdening the wider population, tax rate productions for corporate and individual profits in the business sector exacerbated inequality compounded by chronic tax evasion. The neoliberal shift intensified inequalities in housing and urban development, with luxury housing proliferating for the wealthy amid a backdrop of sprawling informal settlements. And that's what I just said as well. The housing market, when it becomes commodified, it will become a how should I say? It becomes like the need for profit, not the needs of the people, so to speak. The economic policies of Bashar al-Assad fostered unprecedented societal impoverishment, even as GDP grew by 4.3% annually from 2000 to 2010. These economic gains, however, benefited only a small elite, with the GDP more than doubling from $28.8 billion in 2005 to approximately $60 billion by 2010. By 2007, 33% of Syrians lived below the poverty line, with another 30% hovering just above it. The shift in public sector roles to private sector starkly demonstrated the inability of market-driven reforms to achieve social equity. No shit. Neoliberal policies dismantled much of the welfare state, benefiting foreign investors and local elites while destabilizing society. These reforms, intended to modernize Syria and integrate it into the global economy, ironically undermined stability. Exactly. This is what I also said. The reduced subsidies, privatization, and market-driven policies eroded public services, concentrating wealth while widening social divides. This widespread disenfranchisement paved the way for extremist ideologies and contributed to Assad's downfall. For Syria's future to stabilize, a reassessment of neoliberal frameworks is crucial, 100%. The problem is when Bashar al-Assad tried to sort of fight this corruption and all that, he couldn't. These guys saved his life, the military people. So you're gonna steal the wealth that they stole, you're gonna take away the wealth that they stole from the people. No, it's just they're gonna kill you. And I think because we're gonna go through the corruption a little bit more, but the corruption had rotted the state institutions in Syria and just eventually collapsed. There was really no loyalty left to that country anymore. I think we can read this one as well. Yeah, this one is perhaps not related to the neoliberal policies, but let's go through it. So this is from Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. I believe this is a German website, but it has a lot of good information. So Syria, the social origins of the uprising, looking back on the real sources of the Syrian popular uprising before it became an international war. More than 7 years after the beginning of the popular uprising in Syria, which increasingly turned into an international war, the causes of this eruption are often forgotten. When they are discussed, the vast majority of authors reduce the uprising to a struggle against authoritarianism while neglecting its socioeconomic roots almost entirely. Yet, the way in which the relations of production in contemporary Syria constitute a blockage to the development of the productive forces is in fact a key element in understanding the popular base of the Syrian uprising. The most important component of the movement was economically marginalized Sunni ruler workers, along with their urban employees and self-employed workers who have borne the brunt of neoliberal policies, particularly since Bashar al-Assad came to power in 2000. The geography of the revolts in Idlib, Daraa, and other middle-sized towns, as well as in the rural areas, exhibits a pattern, namely, all were historically strongholds of the Baath Party and benefited from agricultural reforms in the 1960s. Exactly. This is your support base. Now you're destroying their means of feeding themselves. Of course, they're going to turn against you, but it is what it is. But anyway, the acceleration of neoliberalism under Bashar al-Assad. Syria underwent an accelerated implementation of neoliberal policies in the decade after Bashar al-Assad took power in 2000, which also represented an instrument with which the new ruler could consolidate his power. Unlike his father, Bashar allowed the World Bank and the IMF to intervene in the process of economic liberalization. In 2005, the social market economy was adopted as a new economic strategy at the Baath Party's 10th Regional Conference. In other words, the private sector, rather than the state, would become a partner and leader in the process of economic development and in providing employment. The aim was to encourage private accumulation principally through the marketization of the economy, while the state withdrew from key areas of social welfare provision, aggravating already existing socioeconomic problems. Now, some people might, well, China did it. Well, China was different. China had a lot of set of conditions in which these private American and Western companies had to abide by. And I think that you had to share experience with the Chinese workers and all that stuff. And they didn't allow their economy to be financialized. That is to say that the financial system is supposed to be dominant in the country. They wanted a strong industrial base, and still China has a pretty strong state ownership, or at least state involvement in their economy. These Middle Eastern countries, particularly Iran and Syria, don't have that. I know Saudi Arabia has a pretty strong state ownership, though. But nonetheless, the attraction of foreign investment and Syrian funds held outside of the country by nationals and expatriates, particularly in the service sector, was fundamental to this new economic strategy. Foreign direct investment climbed from 120 million in 2002 to 3.5 billion in 2010. Investment inflows drove a boom in trade, housing, banking, construction, and tourism. The share of the private economy continued to grow, reaching up to 65% of Syrian GDP, over 70% according to some estimates. In 2010, while also being the largest employer, approximately 75% of the Syrian labor force worked in the private sector. Neoliberal policies benefited the Syrian upper class and foreign investors, particularly from the Gulf monarchies and Turkey, at the expense of the vast majority of Syrians who were hit by inflation and the rising cost of living. During this period, the regime also significantly reduced taxes on business sector profits for both groups and individuals. These measures were implemented despite the fact that tax evasion was already widespread, reaching 100 billion Syrian pounds in 2009, according to some estimates. The small, medium-sized enterprises, which made up more than 99% of all businesses in Syria, were for the most part negatively affected by marketization and economic liberalization. And this is another thing I would like to talk about. Many third world countries do this mistake, is that they open up their markets too early. Western countries have restrictions on their economies and have had so historically, in order for their own industries and agriculture sector to sort of develop and make their countries rich. Many East Asian countries have that. So Syria, despite being isolated under Hafez al-Assad, was actually better off with that state-run economy. But like I said, the bourgeoisie in these countries, they work as a fifth column a lot of times. The Syrian economy became increasingly rent-based as the productive sectors diminished from 48.1% of GDP in 1992 to 40.6% in 2010, while the share of wages in the national income was less than 33% in 2008 to 2009, compared to nearly 40.5% in 2004, meaning the profits and rents constituted more than 67% of the GDP. And this is a horrible way to build an economy. Speculation, rent, interest rate. No, you have to build it via industry. Look at Russia right now. Like, Russia is withstanding Western sanctions because they have turned their economy into a war-like economy, putting heavy emphasis on local production, sort of large industries, okay, with some sort of state control. I'm not saying it's like a socialist economy, but it has definitely socialist elements. I don't believe that 100% planned economy necessarily will work all the time. Can work sometimes. You have to see it works, but you definitely have to have state ownership over key sectors of your economy and the society. And as well, the private sector must also be overseen by the state. Make sure that workers' rights are followed and so forth. These liberalization measures were accompanied by lowering of subsidies, the halting of public sector employment expansion, and the reduction of the state's role in economic investment. Social security spending was reduced considerably by the cutbacks to the pension system in the 2000s. Healthcare and education spending did not rise in accordance with population growth. The share of the education and healthcare sectors as a percentage of GDP expenses was approximately 4% and 0.4% before 2010. In this context, the regime embarked on the gradual privatization of schools, in particular universities and colleges and healthcare. This process was accompanied by the reduction of the quality and quantity of public health services, which forced Syrians to turn to the private sector in order to enjoy basic services. Subsidies were also removed on key foods items, as well as gas and other energy sources. Price liberalization meant the products essential to everyday life grew increasingly unaffordable for most low-income families. Yep, that is a recipe for disaster. I'm just going to see how much it is left, but anyway, we'll see how much. Okay. So, responsibility for social services to ease rising inequalities was increasingly shifted to private charities and therefore bourgeoisie and religious conservative layers of Syrian society, especially religious associations. Now, this was the death blow for the country, because when these religious institutions get their hands on these welfare services, they are going to bring in more followers. And as I stated before, the Saudis and the Gulf monarchy people who were investing in Syria at the time, obviously their money also went to enforcing Wahhabi and Salafi elements of the Syrian society. And they were preying upon people's desperation and anger. And this is the result that you get. In agriculture, land privatization took place at the expense of several hundreds of thousands of peasants from the northeast, particularly following the drought between 2007 and 2009, in which 1 million peasants received international aid and food supplies, driving 300,000 to Damascus, Aleppo, and other cities. However, this social catastrophe should not be perceived as the consequence of a more natural disaster. Even before the drought, Syria lost 40% of its agricultural workforce between 2002 and 2008, dropping from 1.4 million to 800,000 workers. The sector's share of employment fell from 32.9 and 30% in 2000 to just 14 to 13.2% by 2011. What a disaster. So, agricultural liberalization measures took place under Bashar al-Assad from the end of the 2000s, with the privatization of state farms in the north after more than 4 decades of collective ownership. Yet, according to researcher Miriam Ababsa, the real beneficiaries of these privatization processes were nevertheless invested in entrepreneurs able to unlawfully rent out former state holdings. Land ownership became increasingly concentrated in a small number of hands. In 2008, 28% of the farmers utilizing 70% of the irrigated land, while 49% of them had only 10%, evidencing the inequalities in this sector. Yeah, I think you guys get the gist of it. But this last one, the socioeconomic consequences of Syria's neoliberal project, I don't think I need to read that, but this is a good article. You guys get the gist of it. It caused a lot of economic inequality, a lot of unemployment, and when you source out the welfare system to religious institutions, some of whom have very radical point of views, they will obviously start brainwashing people, and people who are angry at the government will rise up against it. And that is the mistake that the Baathist government of Syria did. In this section of the video, I am going to talk about the Caesar sanctions. So the Caesar sanctions, that is to say the protection for civilians, as they call it, right? Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act of 2019. This bill establishes, this is from the U.S. government's website, congress.gov, and this bill establishes additional sanctions and financial restrictions on institutions and individuals related to conflict in Syria. The Department of the Treasury shall determine whether the Central Bank of Syria is a financial institution of primary money laundering concern. If so, Treasury shall impose one or more special measures, such as requiring domestic financial institutions to maintain additional records on transactions involving the bank. The President shall impose sanctions on foreign persons that, one, provide significant support or engage in a significant transaction with the Syrian government, or those acting on behalf of Syria, Russia, or Iran, or are knowingly responsible for serious human rights abuses against the Syrian people. Now, we all know the United States don't give a damn about the Syrian people. But they're, they're good with their rhetoric, at least. But even that is crumbling now, thanks to social media. The bill also imposes sanctions on those that knowingly provide various goods or services to Syria, such as aircraft for the military, technology for the government's domestic petroleum production, items on the U.S. munitions list, and items that the president believes are being used to commit human rights abuses against the Syrian people. Except when we support jihadists, right? Anyway, the sanctions include blocking of financial transactions and barring of entry into the United States. Such sanctions shall not apply to activities related to providing humanitarian aid or supporting democratic institutions in Syria. Yes, because the majority of the opposition you supported were all about women's rights, workers' rights, minority rights. Well, maybe your friends in the SDF, but that's just on paper, though. They literally starved the state out of funding, which caused a lot of this collapse, too. But anyway, the president may suspend the sanctions under certain conditions, including if it is in the United States' national security interests. The Department of State is authorized to assist entities that are conducting criminal investigations and gathering evidence to prosecute those responsible for war crimes in Syria, except when it's our boys. So, This Gray Zone article is absolutely great. It is written by Hekmat Abu Khater. He is himself a Syrian American. I believe his family fled from, I don't know, was it Hama, Homs, or Idlib? I don't remember. But when the Turkish-backed death squads came to his town and basically killed I think it was a taxi driver or something, stole the vehicle. But anyway, he has infiltrated the American Coalition for Syria when they had their annual advocacy in Washington, D.C. And this article is from March 20th, 2024. Excellent article. And we will go through it. A week from the 13th anniversary of the U.S.-backed Syrian dirty war, the American Coalition for Syria held its annual day of advocacy in Washington, D.C. I went undercover into meetings with Senate policy advisors and witnessed the lobby's cynical campaign to starve Syria into submission. And that is exactly what sanctions are for. It's economic warfare in order to isolate this country economically, right? Because the sanctions creates an economic embargo where, let's say, where companies and banks, if they want to make business with this country, they're going to get penalty fees so high that they get discouraged to do it, which in turn will cause a lot of economic issues for the people in that country, and they will basically starve, and they will get so pissed off that they will overthrow that government. And it practically worked in the case of Syria. On the morning of March 7th, as the U.S. Capitol teamed with lobbyists securing earmarks ahead of Appropriations Week, activists decrying the Gaza genocide, one special interest group on the Hill stood out. In the corridors of Rayburn Building, a group of roughly 50 people prepared for a busy day of advocating for sanctions to be levied against their homeland. Against their homeland. They were the anti-Syria lobby, and I had infiltrated their influence campaign. Throughout the day, I watched as this group pushed U.S. officials to accept their policy of starvation sanctions while cynically ignoring famished Palestinians in Gaza. Among the lobbyists was Raed Saleh, the head of the Syrian White Helmets, who were to propagandize for regime change from behind humanitarian cover. And we know the Syrian White Helmets are nothing but a British creation. It's basically an MI6 creation. So I attended a total of 7 meetings with policy teams representing Senators Sherrod Brown, Meggy Hassan, Ben Cardine, Mark Kelly, Chris Van Hollen, John Fetterman, and Rick Scott. Throughout these sanctions, I witnessed the anti-Syria lobby attempt to bully and manipulate U.S. officials into accepting their policy of starvation while cynically throwing starving Palestinians in Gaza under the bus. Let's see here. At one moment, Raed Saleh, head of the Syrian White Helmets, which was founded by British intelligence and funded by NATO states, painted Israeli airstrikes against Syria in a positive light. And yet, these predominantly Muslim Brotherhood, Sunni Muslim, often mainstream organizations here in the West, accuse us of being Rafidi, Shia, Iranian, and Russian stooges or something like that. Hilarious people. Nonetheless, during a separate meeting, Wael al-Zayat of the pro-Zionist Muslim outreach MGAG, or MGAG, even demanded Senator Chris Van Hollen's office support the approval of aid for al-Qaeda-linked militias in Syria. Stop freaking out about the stuff going to terrorists, he insisted, adding that Brits are doing it, the Turks are doing it, and the Qataris are doing it. So he's openly, basically, he has no issue with American aid going to Al Qaeda affiliated groups. Purporting to be a voice for all Syrians, the anti Syria lobby is spearheaded by the American Coalition for Syria, ACS, an umbrella organization representing opposition groups such as the Syrian American Council, and the Syrian Forum, and a handful of others located in the US and Turkey. MGAG, meanwhile, has been credited with getting the diaspora vote out of then candidate Joe Biden in November 2020. The group has since fallen under criticism for acting as a de facto extension of the Biden White House and Democratic Party within the Muslim community. MGAG board member Farouk Mitha formerly went to work for Biden Pentagon for the Biden Pentagon in March 2021. On March 7th, Al-Zayat aimed to weaponize MGAG's influence against Democratic senators who seemed uncomfortable with an escalating sanctions policy. I need a good story for my voters, he explained to Senator Van Hollen's team. Throughout their sanctions campaign on the Hill, Al-Zayat and his cohorts operated like a miniature version of their Israel lobby allies, supplying roughly 50 volunteers with folders outlining talking points and the biographies of congressional representatives. The bios included a comprehensive list of the senator or representative's recorded stance on Syria, such as their votes on the extension of the AUMF, the U.S. military withdrawal from Syria, and the previous sanctions packages targeting the country. The handouts also laid out the lobby's key legislative requests, which largely focused on securing development aid for militia-controlled territory in Syria, including that held by Al-Qaeda's local ally in the country, and ensuring passage of the Assad regime's anti-normalization bill, which seeks to extend and expand sanctions targeting Damascus. And remember, sanctions don't really target or hurt the people who work within the government. It hurts regular people, and that's the whole point. Sanctions are not humanitarian. They're actually very cruel. Now, if Assad hadn't implemented a lot of these neoliberal programs, I believe his country would have maintained a better economic resistance against the sanctions that the West had imposed upon Syria. First of all, the people would have been more, in terms of money-wise, they would have been economically more secure and wealthier. Secondly, your economic industries would be more self-sufficient. The country would be more self-sufficient. Anyway, the anti-Syria lobby's resemblance to their Israeli counterparts was no mistake, as Republican Florida Senator Rick Scott's chief of staff reassured us. The Israelis want you guys in charge. Wow. That was straight out of the horse's mouth. More starvation sanctions. Ever since the U.S. included Syria on its inaugural State Sponsor of Terrorism, SST, list, over Damascus' support for the Palestinian resistance in 1979, Washington has gradually ratcheted up its financial war on the Syrian people. And this is where it's all about at the end of the day. Assad is really no different than many of the Arab rulers in the Middle East or in the Arab world. The only difference was he supported the Palestinian cause, the resistance. He allowed Palestinian groups to set up offices in Damascus. He funneled arms to the West Bank as well as to Lebanon and Hamas as well to a certain extent. So that's the reason. Yeah. When decades of covert hybrid war erupted into an all-out proxy battle for the country's territory and survival in 2011, the anti-Syria lobby officially began to take shape in Washington. And a lot of these Syrians that are in these lobby groups, they tend to be Muslim Brotherhood people. I'm not saying all of them, but many of them. And they often complain about what Bashar al-Assad's father did in Hama back in the 80s. But they also failed to mention the fact that it was the Muslim Brotherhood that attacked a police or military academy first and slaughtered a bunch of people. Hence why Hafez al-Assad outlawed that party and crushed that uprising. They always want to play victim. I noticed that. But anyway, in 2019, as Syria's government emerged victorious from a multi-year battle with foreign-backed militias, Washington decided that while Damascus may have won the war, it would not win the peace. That is if while it is true that Syria, I wouldn't say they won the war back then. It was a frozen conflict. Yes, it appeared they had won because they had pretty much negotiated the Astana deal with Turkey, and Turkey was forced to agree to this because one of their proxy groups, I think it was the Murad Sultan Division, who was affiliated with the SNA, shot down a Russian plane and killed a pilot, right? And to avoid a further crisis, Erdogan had to pretty much sign that deal, which forced these jihadists, because they were getting crushed in Aleppo by Russian, Iranian-backed militias, as well as the Syrian Arab Army and Hezbollah and all that, and forced them into Idlib. And Idlib became the largest concentration of Al-Qaeda fighters after that. Most of whom were foreigners, right? It was where a lot of them were Central Asians, Uyghurs, Albanians, Turks, you name it, and Arabs from Libya and the Gulf states and whatnot. So that is that. And yes, for the longest there, I would say the conflict was frozen, but the Western powers still pushed on with the Caesar sanctions, that is to say, that economic war, in order to further crumble the state. Which means that, just to put this one in, you have to create what the Iranians call a resistance economy. And we have to admit that Iranians, despite their privatization campaigns, they have still maintained a lot of self-sufficient industries within agriculture and weaponry and military and other things. So that's pretty remarkable, and nanotechnology and much more. Anyway, that January, New York Representative Elliot Engel, recipient of 1.8 million in AIPAC donations, introduced the sanctions package known as the Syria Civilian Protection Act. Trump signed the bill as a part of the National Defense Authorization Act and the AA of 2020. The bill was unprecedented in both the way that it sanctioned broad sectors of the Syrian economy rather than only specific individuals, and in its deployment of so-called secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions are imposed on parties that do business with a sanctioned entity, even if those exchanges occur outside of the sanctioning entity's jurisdiction. Syria's economy has been in freefall ever since the Caesar sanctions came into effect. Today, over 12 million Syrians, representing more than half of the total population, face food insecurity, a 51% increase from 2019. Meanwhile, 90% of the population lives under the poverty line, and in 2019, the US dollar exchanged for 500 Syrian pounds. Today, that number is more like 14,100. God damn. Figures that represent a 2,720% devaluation. Let's see. Okay. Anyway, Though HR 3202 appears to be focused on addressing UN aid divergence and sanctioning previously unsanctioned entities like Assad's Syria, Trust for Development, and the Syrian Red Crescent, the real agenda of the bill is found deep within its 22-page text. With the Caesar sanctions set to expire by the end of 2024, H.R. 3202 seeks to quietly extend the aggressive financial measures until 2032. Now we'll see if if they will lift the sanctions on these new people, these new rulers of Syria, whom, by the way, also want to proceed with a neoliberal economy, by the way. But anyway, having passed the House with overwhelming enthusiasm, H.R. 32's sister bill in the Senate can only pass with Democratic support. It was introduced by Israeli lobby-funded Republican Idaho Senator James Risch last September, and has since been co-sponsored by arch neoconservative Florida Senator Marco Rubio. Because what did the S stand for? I forgot. But anyway, because S 2935 can only pass with Democratic sponsorship, the anti-Syria lobby chose Senator Ben Cardin, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and sponsor of the anti-Russia Magnitsky Act, as a crucial target for influence. After meeting with Sherrod Brown's office, Cardin's research and legislative assistant, Christopher Barr, hosted us in the senator's office. There, Raed Saleh of the White Helmets complained to Barr that U.S. aid had slashed funding for the organization from $12 million to $3 million in recent years. Next, it was time to discuss the true purpose of our visit, the passage of S. 2935. Barr appeared uneasy from the outset and even expressed displeasure about the bill, complaining what passed the House was kind of a lot. The list of targets is vast. Syria has already been so heavily sanctioned, he added. In response, Ghanem revealed a critical piece of information about the forces driving the dirty war on Syria, explaining that the impetus to expand and extend Caesar did not come from anti-Syria lobby itself, but someone on Capitol Hill. Ghanem explained that the Hill source actually contacted the American Coalition for Syria to alert them to the fact that Caesar was set to expire, lamenting the fact that its sunset would be amount to a loss of U.S. leverage over the Syrian regime. The line echoed the disturbing language of officials representing both the Biden and Trump administration alike. In 2019, neoconservative operative Dana Stroul declared that thanks to Caesar, Washington holds a card on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back to Syria. She lauded the fact that U.S. would weaponize that and leverage to keep Syria in rubble. Exactly, and that's the whole point. 2 years later, she would take up a post as Deputy Secretary of Defense for the Middle East under Biden. See how long this is. I don't think I'm going to read the whole thing, but I think you guys get the gist of it. These are the goals and purposes of the Caesar sanctions, and that is to economically destroy the country. And sanctions also cause a lot of times corruption in many regards. So that's how it is. But yes, you guys can read this on your own on the Gray Zone. But you got like almost like an overview from the stuff that I read about the type of damage that the Caesar sanctions caused in Syria: food insecurity, devaluation of the Syrian pound, and so forth. So yeah, let's move on. Another key factor to the collapse of the Assad government was rampant corruption. And I'm going to read a short excerpt from this New Lines Institute article. So, corruption, too, is getting worse. Corruption has been a mainstay of governance in Syria for decades, with the Baath regime permitting public sector employees to exploit their positions within state and regime institutions to extort the population and profit from smuggling and other illicit activities in return for their loyalty. The abuse of power by Syrian authorities was one of the main drivers of the uprising in 2011. The growing lawlessness that came to afflict Syria throughout the war, the thriving war economy, and the reduction in the value of salaries of the Syrian state and regime employees increased incentives and opportunities for corruption. That is indeed true, and when you can no longer feed your population properly and house them and stuff like that, they will turn against you. This is common sense. So, exasperating shortages are serving as fertile ground for corruption. All the subsidies, goods unavailable in stores, gas stations, and bakeries can be purchased on the black market. Supplies for which originate with senior and local regime and state officials who steal the coveted goods. And this is also a result of the free market reforms. For example, farmers of eastern Hama have not received their February rations of diesel required for attending to their wheat crops. Arif, the farmer, said, "I've been going to the gas station every day, and it's closed. I went back to the Farmers Association. They told me the owner of the station received the diesel tanker and doesn't want to distribute it. No one can say anything to him. He is one of those with political backing. The owner of the station, located in Tel Jadid, is Basim Nouame, a fuel smuggler and financer of pro-regime militias, who is also a member of the Syrian parliament. While farmers should be able to purchase the diesel for 880 liras per liter, those among them who can afford it on the black market for 17 times the price. The low-quality subsidized bread, which could be sold for 100 liras in state bakeries, sells for at least 300 and up to 1,200 liras on the black market, after being pilfered by bakery employees. The mukhabarat, soldiers, and even Ministry of Internal Trade inspectors sent out to prevent exactly such diversions. So there seems to be some futile attempts to kind of stop this black market, or maybe it was more than futile, but regardless, it didn't work, because a lot of the people within the state and the military were involved in the black market corruption. So this is a pretty good article by Reuters. We can see if we can read all of it. So, for years, the Islamist rebels of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, had sat behind the nearby front line with Syria's long civil war frozen. But on Wednesday, November 27th, Huli's commanding officer at another post behind the front lines called his mobile phone to tell him a rebel convoy was heading his way. Let's see if we can get to the meaty part of this article. Here, this is the collapse, basically. So Reuters spoke to a dozen sources, including 2 Syrian army deserters, 3 senior Syrian officers, 2 Iraqi militia commanders working with the Syrian army, a Syrian security source, and a source familiar with the thinking of Lebanese group Hezbollah, one of Assad's main military allies. Their sources, along with intelligence documents Reuters found in an abandoned military office in the capital, painted a detailed picture of how Assad's once feared army had been hollowed out by demoralization of troops, heavy reliance of foreign allies, particularly for the command structure, and growing anger across the ranks at rampant corruption. Most of the sources asked not to be named because they were authorized to talk to media or feared retribution. Since the war began in 2011, Assad's army command had come to depend on allied Iranian and Iran-funded Lebanese and Iraqi forces to provide the best fighting units in Syria. All the senior sources said. Crucially, much of the Syrian military's operational command structure was run by Iranian military advisors and their militia allies, they said. And here comes the part where the Iranians had left. But many of the Iranian military advisors had left this spring after Israeli airstrikes on Damascus, and the rest departed last week, said the Iraqi militia commanders who worked alongside them. Hezbollah fighters and commanders had already mostly left in October to focus on the escalating war in Lebanon and with Israel, the source familiar with the Hezbollah thinking said. The Syrian army's own central command and control center no longer functioned well after the Iranian and Hezbollah officers left, and the military lacked a defense strategy, particularly for Syria's second city of Aleppo. A Syrian colonel, 2 Syrian security sources, and a Lebanese security source familiar with the Syrian military said. By contrast, rebels in the northwest, on paper numerically far weaker than the army, had spent years consolidating under a single operations room that coordinated their groups and units in battle, an international crisis group report said after the fall of Aleppo. Reuters was unable to contact the current representative of the armed forces. Syria's new most powerful figure, HTS chief Ahmad al-Shara, told Reuters on Wednesday he would dissolve Syria's security forces, Iran's mission to the United Nations. The Iraqi militias and Hezbollah did not respond to requests for comments. So, I'm not going to read the whole article because I thought that was a pretty summarized version of it. But there is one aspect I'm going to read, and that is this part. It's called officers. And then I think we can move on to the next article because this is pretty good. So, the corruption and poor morale went up through the ranks. Many mid-ranking officers had been growing increasingly angry in recent years that the army's sacrifices and successes during the war were not reflected in better pay, conditions, and resources. 2 serving, 1 recently retired, and 1 defected officer said. In 2020, Russia and Turkey agreed a deal that froze the front lines after Assad retook all major cities. Sorry, it's pretty early. I woke up very early. Anyway. And the main highway linking Damascus to Aleppo. Further partitioning a country also split by Kurdish-controlled areas. But Syria's economy continued to reel from U.S. sanctions and reduced foreign aid, said Aaron Lund, a fellow at Middle East-focused think tank Century International. A rampant inflation ensued. Things just got worse for everyone except for the oligarchs and elites around Assad. That seems to have been incredibly demoralizing, Lund said. While in 2021, roughly doubled military salaries to keep up with inflation that topped 100% that year, buying power rapidly fell anyway as the Syrian pound crashed against the dollar. Colonel Makhlouf, who served in an engineering brigade, said that if anybody complained about the corruption, they were called in for questioning at a military court, something that had happened to him more than once. We were living in a scary society. We were afraid to say a word, Makhlouf said. He had been stationed in Hama but deserted before the city fell into the rebels on December 5th, he said in an interview in Aleppo on Tuesday. Anger had been building, particularly over the past year or so, a serving senior military intelligence officer said, saying that there was growing resentment against Assad, including among core high-ranking supporters from his Alawite minority community. So, and this is something that perhaps the supporters of the new regime and media have been kind of misunderstanding, is that all of the Alawites were kind of head on board with Assad and they didn't criticize him, but that's just not true. I'm sure there were Alawites that did criticize Assad for the rampant mafia style corruption that went on in his country. And on top of that, the Syrian government and the army was actually majority Sunni. So it's yeah, the lies are don't make sense when you actually dig deeper into them. But yeah, let's see. Is there anything relevant more? Yeah, this one is perhaps the last one we can read. Sorry, my bad. There's really good information in this article, but so we have to read this last one. But anyway, to fight back the earlier opposition uprising, which began with protests in 2011, Assad relied on allies. Russia sent jets that bombed rebel positions. Iran sent military advisors and fighters from Hezbollah. Iran backed militias from Iraq, and another group it formed from Afghan Shiite fighters also came. Their fighting skill and well-being contrasted with Syria's own soldiers. An Iraqi militia commander serving near Aleppo said he knew of a Syrian platoon meant to consist of 30 soldiers that had only 8 present. The militia often invited these soldiers to eat with them out of pity at the poor condition of their rations, the commander said. Hezbollah and allied militias regarded these regular Syrian forces with little more than contempt, the Iraqi militia commanders and a source familiar with Hezbollah thinking said. They did not trust them for important operations and often would not fight alongside them, those sources added. Actually, when I used to work with unaccompanied refugee children, I had a conversation with a Afghan guy, and he said he knew somebody that had fought in Syria against ISIS and these radical groups, and he was forcefully or willingly, I'm not sure, recruited into the IRGC's Liwat al-Fatimiyun backed militia. And he told me that Syrian soldiers were not as brave as the Iraqi, Lebanese, and Shiite volunteers from Afghanistan, Iran, and other places, right? Pakistan, Bahrain, you name it. So there can be reasons for that. I think that when there's so much rampant corruption in your leads, where you can't even get a ration of proper food, obviously the morale is not going to be very high. So I can't really blame the soldiers that too much. But anyway, this is from the newarab.com. I think they pretty much wrote the similar things as what the Reuters article wrote. I mean, we can, maybe look some of the stuff here. Yeah, we can read a short part of the article. But anyway, low pay, which a lot of soldiers had very low pay, meant bribery was a necessity to survive. And the fact that most conscripts were press ganged from the country's least privileged and connected margins of society enarmored some pity from civilians, unlike the more notorious regime militia, fighters, and intelligence schools who ruled by terror. And this is one thing like I said multiple times when it comes to the Syrian conflict, is that they only talk about the atrocities that comes from the government. Some of these atrocities have also been found not true, such as the Ghouta gas attacks and whatnot. It was fabricated by British intelligence. They seem to not want to talk about the terror that groups like HTS and the Syrian National Army have conducted. But anyway, like civil servants, the conscripts use their positions to extract bribes to supplement their truly unlivable salaries, Simon added. The enlisted have long been among the most destitute, vulnerable people in Syria, so much so that some Syrians would give them bribes willingly as a form of charity. Karam al-Sha'ar, director of Karam Sha'ar Advisory Limited and a Syrian researcher, said the average salary of regime fighter was little more than $20 a month, an amount that would scarcely cover their transport costs. When the HTS columns advanced, there was little impulse to stand and die for a regime that had only extracted and bled them. Even when Assad made a comical last-minute pledge to boost the conscript salaries. The corruption play a role in the regime's collapse? Absolutely it did, Shah told the New Arab. The corruption has undermined the morale of the fighters. It showed everyone in military fatigues that while they were fighting, given just a potato, a loaf of bread, and an egg, they could see photos of Bashar al-Assad living like a king, he added. People came to believe we would not be fighting to defend such a corrupt and self-interested leader, so you saw them just abandoning the posts and not fighting the rebels. The generally humane treatment surrendered soldiers received from the rebels must have been another key factor in the mass defections, most opting for food and protection rather than a bullet to the head. Perhaps anticipating such earlier in the conflict, Sunni conscripts were largely confined in their bases to prevent mass defections to rebel Free Syrian Army, leaving Iranian militias to do most of the fighting. I don't understand the sentence because the Iranians had pretty much left at that point. So yeah, this is the state, the absolute horrendous state of the Syrian Arab army and the Syrian state that eventually led to this decay. Obviously, we haven't. There's probably more stuff that's going to come out with the years to come, and it's going to be interesting to see, and we hopefully can cover that. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys for watching my videos. Like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.